Okay, good afternoon. Today is March 14th, 2020, and we are in Cary, North Carolina. Can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Namaste. My name is Smitha Prasad, and I am a Carnatic classical vocalist. Carnatic music is classical music that comes from the southern part of India, and I'm a performing vocalist. Been practicing since before I can even remember, but that's in a nutshell who I am.
Great. So what is your earliest memory?
Oh, the earliest memory that I have is actually going to sleep on my mother's lap. She was a very well-known Carnatic music teacher, and the earliest memory that I have is of laying down in her lap, and because she would constantly have students, I would fall asleep in her lap as she was teaching, and I would wake up and she would still be teaching, and that's my earliest memory.
Do you know how old you were at that time?
Oh, I was probably maybe 3, 4, maybe even younger. Yeah, but pretty young.
Great. So I read that you were born in Kuwait.
I was actually born in India, but moved to Kuwait very young.
Okay.
Probably when I was maybe a year old, or maybe even less than a year old. So for all practical purposes, yes, that's. Okay. I consider that my home.
And why was your family there?
So my father worked in Kuwait. I think like a lot of people during the, I think the 70s, was looking for, I guess, bigger horizons. He was educated in India, was working in India, but I think was looking for opportunities to broaden his experience, and I think Kuwait came a calling, and so that's how we ended up going there. And that's where I think I spent most of my life was in Kuwait.
Great. And you started studying with your mother.
I started studying with my mother. So my mother was she had her initial vocal training, all of her vocal training in India itself. And then when she came to Kuwait, I think one of the things that she missed was having sort of this way to keep connecting with her music. And so she found that there were a lot of people that wanted to learn. There were a lot of people of Indian origin who had started settling down in Kuwait and who wanted to learn Indian classical music, either because they had never had a chance to learn it before, or because they had learned it before but wanted to find a way to connect back with it. So she started her music classes just in our home. It was a small home that we had, but we would constantly have students and people coming in and out to learn. So a lot of my music learning happened with my, just by listening to my mother teaching other students, and slowly but surely I kind of got into the process where I would start formally learning with her. But I think one of the funny things is always I would find fault with my mother and say, you have time to teach everybody in the world, but you don't have time to teach me. And so a lot of my learning just happened because she would keep teaching all the other students, and I would say, oh, I want to learn what that person is learning. Can you teach me that? And she would say, yes, I will teach you. But a lot of times she would never find the time. So one of the other memories that I have is, she would have classes every evening, and it would be about 8 o'clock in the evening when she was done. And she would say, oh, I need to start cooking dinner because your dad is going to come home. And I'd be like, but I have not had my classes yet. When is that going to happen? And we lived in a very tiny apartment with a very small kitchen. And so she would say, okay, come on, I'm going to start cooking. Let me do your lessons then. So while she was cooking, I would be sitting there in front of the refrigerator and trying to sing my lesson, and she would be cooking and she'd say, move this side, I need to open the refrigerator door and get stuff out. And so that was how, in fact, a lot of my lessons happened, was just, in the small kitchen, while my mother was cooking, just any time that I could get with her. That was how it happened initially. And then, of course, as she saw that I had more and more interest in the whole thing and that I was willing to put in the time and effort, it switched to a much more sort of formalized schedule where she would actually set aside time for me. And that used to be my biggest thing, was she would one day turn around and say, oh, I don't have time to teach you. So I would always make sure that there was time inbuilt, to have my schedule, that sort of thing. So.
Great. What was it like to study with your mother?
It was actually not bad at all. My mother was, she still is a very good teacher. She is my biggest supporter, she offers the best critiques. When I'm down, and I think some days that the concert has gone really badly, she's always finds something good or the other. And then on other days when, I'm like, oh, I think, things are going really well, she's always like, yes, here's all the areas that you need to improve on. So in terms of that, my mom knows exactly what to say. It was actually a wonderful experience learning with my mother, just because she was a very good teacher. She was actually a much better, I feel, she was in fact a much better teacher than a performer, because she had been used to teaching a myriad of students. And for me, I was very clearly sort of able to, navigate this world of having my mother both as a teacher as well as a mother. So I never, a lot of times we have people who say, oh, I was not able to distinguish my mother and my teacher. To a certain extent, that was the case with me, but it was never in a bad way. She was always very supportive in the way she taught, and I was very eager to please her. Like all children are, we all want to please our parents. We always have this inherent, I think, need to please, and this inherent nature of approval. And for me, that was a very big thing, was, doing these things to get my mother's approval. So it was a wonderful experience. I don't think there's, the only thing, as I said, was just making sure I got that one-on-one time with her, was because she was a very busy teacher. But other than that, it was a fantastic experience for me to learn with her. I mean, even now, there are days and times that I call her up and I say, I'm working on this particular piece. What do you think if I sing it this way or versus singing it that way? And even now, we have technology, so she's always sort of saying, oh, think about, this doesn't quite sound that right. Maybe you can approach it this way. So even now, I look to my mother for guidance, just because, as I said, she's a very, very good teacher.
Great. So was there like an infrastructure for concerts in Kuwait, or?
So when I was growing up, there wasn't as much of an infrastructure. So it was more of, I think, an informalized structure. Yes, because, as a Carnatic vocalist, typically we perform, we are the vocalist, we also have a percussionist, and we have an instrumentalist, typically a violin. So was there that sort of infrastructure where we could perform in terms of getting the ensemble together? Slowly but surely, there were people that were coming in. It wasn't, as I said, as much as a formalized structure, but we did have support, definitely, for it. Growing up, there were a lot of opportunities that were created for us to sort of, I guess, to give us a way to express our music, to showcase what we had been learning, even though we were in I guess a country that was different from our country of origin, country of birth, and things like that. But there were opportunities that were being created, not to the extent that there is today, whether it is in Kuwait or in the US or everywhere else around the world. I think there's so many more opportunities, so much of formalization that has happened. It used to be there, but as I said, not as formalized, but it was certainly there. And that's sort of what gave us even the idea that we could pursue this, professionally, even though we were, sort of in a country that was different than where this music originates from.
Great. So, were there other musical experiences around? I don't know how old you were were there experiences at school, or what else were you listening to?
Absolutely. So I went to school, I guess, in a Catholic convent school. But the school was always great at making sure that we had plenty of opportunities to sort of express, whether it was music, whether it was dance, and giving us ways that we could incorporate what we were learning into school presentations, things like that. there were those opportunities from school. And as I said, outside of that, the community had plenty of opportunities where we could present what we were learning, whether it was, as I said, classical music, classical dance. Since I come from a family of classical musicians, classical music and classical dance is the only thing that we knew. In terms of what I was listening to, my parents were quite open about the influences that we could listen to. We had a lot of classical music playing at home. Both Indian classical music, North Indian classical music, South Indian classical music. Predominantly it was South Indian classical music, but there was a lot of Indian classical music. Of course, I had my friends that were die-hard Madonna and Michael Jackson fans, so that also did form part of my listening repertoire. And I didn't know it at that time, but now that I look back on it, there are so many different things that you can incorporate from every genre of music that you listen to. The only thing is you must have, I guess, the knowledge to know what you should take and what you should not take in a way that enhances your music and that doesn't sort of mask what your music is all about.
Right. So how do you think growing up in Kuwait affected your music making?
I think, growing up in Kuwait, we would still make annual trips back to India because my grandparents used to live there. We were a very close-knit family. And my parents always wanted to make sure that we maintained, our roots and our connections to family back home. So we would go back every year. It was an annual trip. Summer vacations were spent in India. And that's when I think we also got the opportunity to listen to a lot of the music that was happening in India itself. My parents would take us for a lot of concerts, just making sure that we got to listen to both the young and upcoming artists as well as established artists who were there. So a lot of the sort of passive learning, if you want to call it, happened during those visits. And every visit, of course, my parents would come back with, those were the days of cassette tapes. They would come back loaded with audio cassette tapes to last us through the next 9 months. And my mother would sort of do this guided listening where she would be like, listen to this, see how well they have sung this. Oh, this is the tune that you're learning. This is the song that you're learning. This is the composition that you're learning. Listen to how they've interpreted it. Now this is how I'm going to teach it to you. See how you can kind of bridge the two. What do you like about this? So there's a lot of guided listening as well as passive listening. But yeah, that's how we kind of got in a lot of the listening done.
Mm-hmm. Great. And at some point your family moved back to India, do I have that right?
Correct. So during the first Gulf War, I was a student then and we were vacationing in India and opened the newspapers one morning to find out that Kuwait had been invaded. And so we ended up staying back in India. Bangalore was the city where we were staying. And my parents, I guess, immediately got me into school because they knew that it was going to be a while. With a war, you never know what's going to happen. Right. So immediately got me into school, and one of the first things was, all right, now you're here, we need to find you a music teacher. Because my mother was obviously busy trying to figure out, what's going on with the household. Are we going to, are we going to move back? Are we not going to? So one of the first things they did was after school, find you a music teacher. So it was sort of in that they were both done almost simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was the decision to not move back made quickly, or you?
It was a process. I think part of it was the fact that I think the liberation of the country itself took about a year, and then at that point of time, had already been in school. I did not like the move back because I was a teenager. This is before the days of the internet, so I couldn't speak the language very fluently. I had no frame of reference. All my, it was Tom Cruise had just then come out with, I think it was maybe Top Gun or one of those things. And then back in India, everybody was talking about these Bollywood actors that had come out, and I had no frame of reference for anything. So I did not like the move at all. But I think like anything, what happens is after a while, you find a footing, you start figuring out things for yourself, and you realize that, maybe this is indeed where I'm supposed to be, this is where I'm going to end up going. So it was a family decision that was also compounded by my father's ill health, and so I think they just said, you know what, we're just going to move the family back and see what happens. So,
have you been back to Kuwait?
I went back once very early on, but it was very different than the Kuwait that I had grown up. I have not been back since, but I hope to someday. Friends tell me it's very different than the Kuwait that we grew up in.
Okay.
But, change is part of life.
Can you talk a bit about how it was different when you went back?
So when I went back, it was still very early on. It was just the mood was very somber. I think when I went back, it was maybe 1992, which was just probably a year after Kuwait had been liberated. So mood was very somber, a lot of, I think the main thing that was missing for me was friends and family, people that I was used to seeing. I went back for probably maybe 3 weeks to spend with my father, and it was just there were people that, I had grown up with that decided not to move back. And so there was just a new set of people, there were new stores that I had never seen. So just even the smallest of things, which to a child you're like, no, but this is the store that was supposed to be there. That's where I went and, hung out with my friends, or that's where we used to go and eat, every Thursday night or something like that. And so it was just very small things, but I think there's just this whole change that had come about in the environment.
So how was studying music in India different than studying with your mother?
So in India, when we moved back, I actually started studying with a formalized teacher. So I think, and this is after many, many years of studying with my mother. So I think that in itself was sort of a big change, where you suddenly go from, studying with your mother to another person. That was a change. And then the second thing was, with my mother, it was sort of, at times it had been informalized, because as much as you try to formalize it, there's still an air of informality when you're learning with your mother. There were times when I would just say, oh, I would be humming something and I'd be like, oh, I've forgotten what this was. Can you just say what you taught me? And she would just sing it. But when you go to learn with a formalized, when there's a formalized structure, you're in your classes for 2 hours a day, 3-4 times a week. But then if you have a doubt about what you've learned, you either have to figure it out yourself, or you have to wait until the next time you go back to your teacher and ask them, I have this thing that you taught me last time, can I clarify? So for me, that was a very big difference, not having 24/7 access to my teacher, just to say, hey, wake up, I have this question about what you taught me. And my mother, of course, being my mother, would, immediately sort of clarify whatever she had taught me then. So I think the biggest thing was not having that 24/7 access to a teacher. But as I said, in all fairness, I had wonderful, wonderful teachers who brought about more of a formality in terms of performance. Because my mother was a very good teacher. But when it comes to performing, that's a whole different sort of personality that you need. There are different aspects of performing that you need, which are different than when you're just either teaching or when you're just learning. Performance is a very, very different, it has a whole other dimension to it, which I think, in my humble opinion, there are people that are very good at performance, and they're able to bring that out in you. They're able to teach you these nuances that are needed in order to deliver a strong stage performance. That's, of course, apart from the fact that you need to be a good instrumentalist, good vocalist. But I think the stage performance has a certain dimension to it, which to a certain extent you need to be made aware of. Even if you cannot learn it, somebody needs to make you aware of all the dynamics that are needed for stage performance.
Can you maybe give an example of some of the skills, or can you just delve a little bit deeper into how the stage, what skills do you learn, by thinking about the stage?
Right. So there are a lot of things when it comes down to performance versus, when you're just singing more in a learning environment. I I think one of the biggest differences is just the overall polished sort of presentation skills that you need. And so one of the things is when you're, obviously when we all first learned or first started learning music, it was never with sort of the idea that I was going to become a seasoned performer, or that I was even considering a performing sort of, the idea that I would perform on stage someday. It was just with the notion of learning. So it was never done with the aspect of, hey, you will have finite time. Like you might just have 45 minutes for a concert. What would you present in that? Versus, oh, now you have the time to present a 3-hour concert. What would you present in that? What are the different things that you would structure in the way that you would present? Because what you're presenting to the audience could be a mix of people that have no idea what you're singing about, to people that are extremely technical, who are probably musicians themselves, who will know the nuances of every single thing that you sing. So how would you tailor a presentation to something that would appeal to this broad range of audience, sort of understanding capabilities of the audiences at large? When I was learning, it was just more like, hey, this is what I know and I'm going to sing it, without sort of the idea of the perspective of the audience. So one of the biggest things about performance is you sort of start to see, well, who's the audience that I'm singing to? Because inherently the nature of a performing art is that there is an audience to accept what you're going to sing. So knowing that there is an audience, one of the first things, as I said, is putting yourself in the audience's shoes and saying, what are they coming to listen to? What is the broad mix of an audience that I have? Are they, people that are super technical? Where is this concert being held? Is this being held in a very formalized sort of presentation arena, or is it being held in a more informal arena? Is it a 30-minute concert? Is it a 2.5-hour concert? So obviously the way that you present would vary depending on all of these factors. And I think when I was learning, these are all not things that I even considered. It was just, hey, I'm going to do this, I'm going to sing this, and then that's it. Part of it is also learning to think on the fly. So, you start presenting something. Typically, all of our concerts, we have multiple compositions that we present. And if you find that you go in and you have a certain set of compositions that you think you're going to present, and you find and you go in and you're like, this is not resonating quite as well as I hoped with the audience. Maybe they speak a different language. Maybe this is not resonating quite as well. You should have the ability to sort of tailor your presentation, change it. You find, oh, the audience sort of identifies with this, a little bit more than they did with something that I had presented previously. Even though at the end of the day, that should not rule what you present. To a certain extent, I think you do need to take in, audience likes and dislikes and things like that.
Right. Okay, great.